A dying white woman pressed her pen so hard into the paper that it tore through. Her hand shook. Her breath came in shallow, rattling pulls, and with her last ounces of strength, she confessed, to a black maid she had never once called by her first name, that the two little girls who had spent 12 years whispering to each other through a porch railing were sisters, half-sisters, bound by the same white man's blood. That letter arrived in 1995, and it detonated everything. But to understand why it detonated, to understand the full weight of what that confession meant, you have to go back to Birmingham, Alabama, back to 1963, back to a little black girl named Lila, who had no idea that the pale, trembling child on the other side of a white wooden railing was the mirror of her own blood. The summer Lila turned 9, her mother Geneva started a new job. It wasn't really a new job. It was the same kind of work black women in Birmingham had been doing for generations, cleaning houses that smelled of lemon polish and cigarette smoke, scrubbing the floors of families who would never invite them to sit at their own kitchen tables. But this particular house on Highland Avenue was different. This particular house had a backyard, and in that backyard, behind a screen of tangled wisteria and a 6-foot white wooden fence, lived a secret. Geneva didn't know about the secret when she took the job. She only knew that the pay was better than most, $3 a day, paid in cash on Fridays by Mr. Vincent Holloway, a railroad executive who smelled of bourbon before noon and rarely looked his housekeeper in the eye. Mrs. Marguerite Holloway was the one who opened the door on Lila's first morning, a thin woman with powder caked into the creases of her face and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You can leave your girl in the front yard," Marguerite said, not quite looking at Lila. "Just keep her out back. We have a garden. Private." Geneva nodded. She had heard that tone before, the tone white women used when they wanted to say something cruel but were too polished to say it outright. She squeezed Lila's shoulder and whispered, "You stay where I can see you, baby. You hear me? Don't you go wandering." Lila heard her. She nodded. She was a quiet girl, the kind of child who read library books under the covers with a flashlight until her mother caught her and scolded her for wasting the batteries. Books were Lila's whole world. Words were the only thing that had ever made her feel like she was more than what the world said she was allowed to be. So when Geneva disappeared into the Holloway house that first morning, Lila did what she always did. She found a quiet spot in the shade of the front porch, pulled a tattered copy of The Secret Garden from her pocket, and began to read. It was maybe 20 minutes into the story. Mary Lennox had just discovered the locked door when Lila heard it. A sound. Soft. Almost not there at all. She looked up. The front porch of the Holloway house wrapped around the left side of the building, and at the far end, a white wooden railing divided the porch from a side yard. Behind that railing, half hidden by overgrown azalea bushes, a small face was watching her. Lila froze. The face belonged to a girl, maybe 7 years old, with hair so pale it was almost white. Her eyes were wide and a watery blue, and her mouth was open just slightly, as if she had been in the middle of saying something and forgotten how to finish. She was thin, too thin. Her dress was wrinkled, as if it had been slept in for several days. And she was gripping the railing with both hands, her knuckles bone white, the way a child grips the edge of a pool when she is afraid of falling in. Lila looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something that, in 1963, Birmingham, Alabama, took more courage than most adults in the city could have mustered. She walked over to the railing. She sat down cross-legged on her side, and she held up her book so the girl on the other side could see the cover. "I'm Lila," she said softly. "Do you want me to read to you?" The pale girl blinked. Her lower lip trembled, and then, in a voice so small it sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, she whispered a single word. Yes, her name was Dove. She couldn't say it right. Not the L's, not the R's, not the W's. Duva, Wadi and God. Yes, Yurdi. But she could feel stories. Lila learned that within the first 10 minutes. When Lila read aloud about Mary Lennox being sent away from her home in India, Dove's eyes grew enormous and her breath came faster. When Mary discovered the secret garden behind the locked door, Dove made a sound, half gasp, half laugh, that she immediately tried to swallow. And when Lila reached the part where Colin, the sickly boy hidden away in the manor house, finally stood up on his own 2 feet and walked out into the garden, Dove began to cry. Not the way a child cries when she skins her knee. The way a person cries when she's been waiting her whole life to feel something, and finally does. Lila reached through the slats of the railing. Dove reached back, their fingers, one brown, one pale as paper, laced together for just a moment before a screen door banged somewhere inside the house, and both girls yanked their hands away like they had been burned. That was the first lesson. But it would not be the last. Over the next several weeks, Lila figured out the truth about Dove Holloway. She was Vincent and Marguerite's daughter, the eldest of the Holloway children technically, but the one the family had decided did not exist. The first time Geneva heard Marguerite say the word out loud, she was standing on a stepladder polishing the silver candlesticks in the dining room, and Marguerite was on the other side of the swinging kitchen door, talking on the telephone to her sister in Montgomery. The door was cracked exactly 1 inch, and Marguerite's voice carried, "Marguerite, honey, you simply cannot keep her in the house forever," the sister was saying, her tinny voice crackling through the receiver. "She's nearly 8. People will talk." "Let them talk," Marguerite said. There was a long pause. Then, lower, in the voice of a woman confessing something she was ashamed of. "What on earth are we supposed to do with an unmarriageable daughter?" Geneva's hand had stopped. Her polishing cloth had gone still. The word, unmarriageable, had landed on her like a hand across the face. She thought of her own daughter downstairs on the porch, bright, brilliant Lila, and what the world would say about her someday, and whether unmarriageable was a word that ever really meant what it claimed to mean. She did not breathe. She did not move. And when Marguerite hung up the phone and came back through the kitchen, Geneva was polishing the same candlestick she had been polishing 4 minutes earlier, her face smooth, her eyes cast down, her hand as steady as a confessional. Marguerite walked past her without a word, without even seeing her, the way you walk past a piece of furniture. And Geneva, in the silence that followed, made a decision she would take 32 years to understand the full weight of. She never said a word. The lessons continued, year after year. Lila and Dove sat on either side of that porch railing and did something small and defiant and holy. They read. Lila borrowed books from the Colored Branch Library on her side of town. She smuggled them into the Holloway yard inside her school satchel, hidden beneath her arithmetic workbook. She read, A Wrinkle in Time to Dove when they were 11. To Kill a Mockingbird when they were 13. Their eyes were watching God when they were 15. And every single time, Dove drank the words in like a woman dying of thirst. But the years between 1963 and 1970 were not the quiet years the books sometimes made them feel like. Birmingham in those years was bleeding. And on the night of September 15th, 1963, it bled most of all. Lila remembers it still. She was 9. Dove was 7. The summer heat had not yet broken, and the 2 girls were on either side of the railing as they always were. Lila in the middle of a chapter of Charlotte's Web, when a car horn honked 3 times from inside the Holloway house. Then a screen door slammed. Then a woman, one of Marguerite's friends, Lila never learned which one, came running out onto the back porch with her hand pressed over her mouth and tears running down her face. Marguerite ran out behind her. "What is it? What is it?" And the woman said, in a voice that sounded like someone was standing on her chest, "The church, the children's church, they bombed it. They bombed it while the children were inside." Marguerite made a sound Lila had never heard a grown woman make. She reached for the porch column. She missed. She slid down the wood until she was sitting on the floorboards with her skirt fanned out around her, and she put both hands over her ears, and she said over and over and over, "No, no, no, no." Lila had stood up from the railing. Her book was forgotten on the ground. She did not know yet what had happened. She only knew that somewhere, a long way off, sirens were beginning to scream. She looked through the slats. Dove was on the other side, gripping the railing, her face as white as paper. "Luva," Dove whispered. The L was wrong. It was always wrong. "Luva, I'm scared." "I know, baby." Lila's voice was shaking. "I know, come here. Come to the railing. I'm right here." Dove pressed her face between the slats. Lila pressed hers from the other side. And for a long moment, the two of them breathed the same air through the white wooden slats, one brown face, one pale face, both of them trembling. While the sirens wailed and the summer cicadas screamed, and 4 miles away, 4 little girls who would never read another book were being pulled out of the rubble of their own church. Lila picked up Charlotte's Web. She opened it to the chapter they had been on, and in a voice that shook so badly she could barely get the words out, she began to read. "Well," said the spider, "I have a few things to say about spinning. Do you know what a spinneret is?" Dove closed her eyes. She leaned her forehead against the slats, and the words, small, ordinary, stubbornly there, carried her through the night. Across the yard, in a study on the second floor of the Holloway house, Vincent Holloway heard the news on the radio. He was sitting in the leather wingback chair his father had left him, a glass of bourbon balanced on the armrest, a cigarette burning down to his knuckles. The radio was on low because Marguerite had a headache, and the announcer's voice was saying the words 16th Street Baptist and 4 little girls and dynamite in the same flat, practiced tone that white Birmingham used for any news involving Black Death. Vincent did not move. He did not turn the radio off. He took a long drink of the bourbon and let it burn down his throat, and he thought with the cold, clear precision of a man who has been drinking since breakfast, "There, but for the grace of God." Then he thought, "Dove." He set the glass down. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, which was draped over the back of the chair, and he pulled out a photograph. It was small. It was creased. It was the only photograph he had ever taken of his eldest daughter, taken on her 5th birthday, before Marguerite had decided the girl was not to be seen. Dove was sitting on the back porch steps in a yellow dress, her white blonde hair in 2 thin braids, looking up at whoever was holding the camera with an expression Vincent had never been able to name. It was not joy. It was not fear. It was the look of a child who has learned, very early, to make herself small enough not to be a problem. Vincent looked at the photograph for a long time. His thumb traced the edge of Dove's face, and then, slowly, with the care of a man handling something that might shatter in his hands, he folded the photograph back into the coat pocket. He picked up the bourbon. He turned the volume of the radio down another notch, and he did nothing. He did not go downstairs. He did not go out into the backyard. He did not kneel beside his hidden daughter and put his arms around her. He did not walk to 16th Street. He did not write a check. He did not pick up the telephone. He sat in his father's chair, in his father's house, and he drank his father's bourbon. And he did absolutely, perfectly nothing. That is what Vincent Holloway was. Not a monster. He was not strong enough to be a monster. Monsters act. Vincent was a coward. And cowards, in 1963 Birmingham, did not even have to be told to look the other way. They had been trained for it from birth. He had been trained for it from birth. The lessons continued year after year, through the marches, through the fire hoses, through the 4 little girls buried at 16th Street, through every slow, grinding year of a war that was being fought on Lila's side of the railing, and never, not once, on his. And then, in the summer of 1970, the summer before Lila turned 16, 2 things happened that would change everything. The first was that Geneva finally told Lila the truth about her father, or rather, what little truth Geneva had. He was a man, Geneva said, in the dark, in their little kitchen, with a gas burner ticking softly behind her. He was a white man. I was 17. He said he loved me. He said he'd take care of me. He said a lot of things, baby. He said them. And then he went back to his wife. And he never said them again. Lila stared at her. The room was spinning. The gas burner ticked. And somewhere deep in her chest, something cold and quiet settled in, like a stone dropped into a well. "The man on Highland Avenue," Lila whispered. "Mr. Holloway." Geneva closed her eyes. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The second thing that happened was worse. That same summer, Vincent Holloway caught Lila and Dove at the railing. He came home early, drunk as usual, but earlier than expected. He came around the side of the house, just as Lila was helping Dove sound out the word beautiful. B-A-U-T-I-F-U-L. And the moment he saw the 2 girls, his face went the color of old brick. He didn't shout. That was the worst part. He just stood there, swaying slightly, and looked at the black girl on one side of the railing and the pale girl on the other. And something moved across his face. Not anger. Not exactly. Recognition. The slow, sick recognition of a man who has just been caught standing in his own lie. "You," he said softly, looking at Lila, "get away from my house. And don't you ever come back." Lila stood. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her thighs to keep them still. She looked at Dove one last time. Dove's face was a white, terrified mask. Her hands were gripping the railing so hard her knuckles had turned to bone. "I'll come back," Lila whispered. "Dove, I'll find you, I promise." And then she turned and she ran, and she did not come back. For 32 years, she did not come back. Atlanta, 1995. The office of Dr. Lila Calloway, Distinguished Professor of African American Literature at Spelman College, looked out over a magnolia-lined quad where young black women in cardigans were crossing the grass with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Lila's framed degrees hung on the wall behind her desk. A doctorate from Howard, a master's from Yale, a bachelor's from Fisk. 3 of her books sat on the shelf beside them, each with her photograph on the back cover. A tall, fine-boned woman in her late 40s, with a face that had learned long ago not to flinch at the sound of her own name. She had built a life. After the Holloways, after the railing, after the long, silent years of running, she had built herself a fortress of words and work and purpose. She taught. She wrote. She raised 2 daughters of her own, both of them now in graduate school, both of them fierce. She had married a good man, a civil rights attorney named Solomon, who had died of a heart attack in 1989 and whom she still talked to on slow Sunday afternoons. And she had not thought about Dove Holloway in almost a quarter of a century. But her mother had. Geneva was 71 years old in the spring of 1995, and she was dying. The cancer had eaten through her pancreas the way a vine eats through a brick wall. Slow, patient, absolutely unstoppable. She weighed less than 90 pounds. She spent most days in the rocking chair by the window of her little bungalow in Ensley, looking out at the street where she had raised Lila alone, always alone. On the morning of April 14, 1995, the mailman knocked on Geneva's door at 8:14 a.m. He handed her a single envelope. White, heavy. The return address, in spidery, trembling handwriting, read, Mrs. Marguerite Holloway, 2198 Highland Avenue, Birmingham, Alabama. Geneva's hand began to shake before she had even opened the envelope. Her heart, already a fragile, fluttering thing, began to pound so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She carried the letter to the rocking chair. She sat down. She opened it, and the first thing she saw, scrawled in the margin in Marguerite's dying hand, was a single line. Geneva, forgive me. I am dying, and I cannot take this with me. What Geneva read next, in 3.5 pages of nearly illegible script, was not a letter. It was a confession, written in a hand that shook so badly the letters had to be guessed at, in a voice Lila would come to hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. This is what Marguerite Holloway wrote. Geneva, I have been sitting at this desk for 2 hours. I do not know how to begin. My hand will not stop shaking. I am dying. The doctors have given me until Easter, and Easter is next month, so you will understand, I hope, that I do not have the luxury of writing this prettily. I am going to tell you the truth. I should have told you the truth 32 years ago. I should have told you the truth the day I met you on my front porch and told you to keep your girl out of my backyard. I have been a coward my whole life, Geneva. I have been a coward in the specific, polished, expensive way that white Southern women are taught to be cowards. And I am sorry. I am so sorry. I do not expect you to forgive me. I am writing this only because I cannot die with this in my chest. You already know that Dove is my husband's daughter. That was not, by 1995, any great revelation. Dove is a pale, blonde child, born to a pale, blonde mother, and Birmingham has long ago decided she is simply my late-blooming surprise. I have maintained that fiction for 38 years. I have maintained it with dresses and tutors and locked doors and the lie of a slow child who was never slow. I have maintained it through every dinner party, every church pew, every photograph on the mantle that does not include her. But that is not the secret I have to tell you. There was a line crossed out, then a pause. The pen pressed hard enough to leave a dent in the paper. Then, Geneva. Vincent is Lila's father too. He told me, before Lila was born. He told me in a hotel room in New Orleans, drunk, weeping, begging me to understand. He had fathered a child on a black girl in Birmingham. He gave you money. He gave you the cleaning job. He gave you 100 small, cowardly kindnesses over the years, all of them designed to buy his own silence. And I watched him do it. I watched him send you money to keep you quiet. And I understood exactly what he was paying for. You let her raise that child alone, she had written. You let her scrub my floors while you sent money to keep her quiet. And then, when that little girl was 9 years old, you let me hide our daughter in the backyard like a piece of broken furniture because you could not bear for anyone to know what you had done. And I let you. I let you do all of it. My husband is not a brave man, Geneva. He is not a strong man. He is a man who was raised in a house where the worst thing a white man could do was love a black child openly, and the second worst thing was admit he had done it. He chose the second worst thing. He has been choosing it for 40 years. And I chose it with him. Every day. Every dinner party. Every Sunday morning when I sat in the front pew of the church and pretended the girl in the backyard did not exist. I am a coward, Geneva. I have been a coward my whole life. And I am dying of a cancer I deserve, and I am asking you on my knees to forgive me, and to give this letter to Lila, because she deserves to know, and because Dove deserves to know who is looking for her. There was a long blank space at the bottom of the third page. Geneva could see, even in the dying handwriting, that the pen had been set down and picked up several times. Finally, in a shaking hand, Marguerite had added one more line. Dove lives in Montgomery now. She teaches children like herself, the ones the world has tried to throw away. Her address is enclosed. I beg you, Geneva, find her. Tell her. Let them know each other before there is no one left to know. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I will not write this again. Marguerite Geneva sat in the rocking chair for a long time. The letter trembled in her hands. The clock was ticking. The magnolia tree outside the window was blooming, soft and white, as if nothing in the world had changed. And then she picked up the telephone, and she dialed her daughter's number. And when Lila answered, Geneva said 6 words that would split the next 30 years of her daughter's life clean down the middle. Baby, you need to come home. Lila drove to Birmingham that night. She did not stop to eat. She did not stop to sleep. She drove through the dark like a woman being chased, the letter in the passenger seat beside her, Marguerite's spidery handwriting flashing in her head like a film reel she could not turn off. Vincent is Lila's father too. Vincent is Lila's father too. Vincent is Lila's father too. By the time she reached Ensley, it was past midnight. Geneva was asleep in the hospital bed they had set up in the front room, her breath rattling softly, a folded handkerchief pressed into her palm. Lila sat beside her mother's bed and held her hand and did not let go until morning. It took her 3 days to decide what to do. On the 4th day, she got in her car and drove to Montgomery. Dove Holloway Webb, married now, married to a kind, gentle music teacher she had met at a conference for educators of exceptional children, lived in a small yellow house on a tree-lined street not far from Alabama State. The house had a wide front porch, and there were wind chimes on it, and a wooden sign over the doorbell that read, in Dove's own careful hand, all are welcome here. Lila parked across the street. She sat in the car for a long time. Her hands were on the steering wheel, her heart was in her throat, and the question she could not answer was the simplest one in the world. What do I say? She did not have to answer it, because at 9:14 in the morning, the front door of the yellow house opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch to water a hanging basket of red geraniums. She was in her late 40s, slightly built, with hair that had gone iron gray since the last time Lila had seen her. She was wearing jeans and a blue button-down shirt, and reading glasses pushed up on top of her head. There was a hearing aid in her left ear. She had a coffee mug in one hand and a watering can in the other. She looked up. She saw the car. She saw the woman in the driver's seat, and the watering can slipped from her fingers and crashed to the porch floor. Leela got out of the car. She crossed the street. She walked up the front path, and when she reached the bottom of the porch steps, she stopped, because Dove was already coming down them slowly, one hand on the railing, the way a person walks when she is afraid her legs are going to give out.
"Lila?"
Dove whispered.
"Lila?"
"It's me," Lila said. Her voice broke on the second word. Her eyes were burning. "Dove, it's me. They met in the middle of the porch. They did not embrace, not yet. They just stood there, looking at each other, the wind chimes chiming softly above them, the geraniums trembling in their hanging basket, the whole world narrowing to the size of two women and a truth that had waited 32 years to be spoken. "My mother told me," Dove whispered, "before she died. She told me a black girl used to come to the railing. She told me that girl taught me to read. She told me—" Her voice cracked. She pressed her hand to her mouth. "She told me that girl was my sister." Lila nodded. She could not speak. She tried. She could not. "I have been waiting," Dove whispered, "for you to come back. Every day, for 32 years, I have been waiting." Lila felt the dam inside her chest begin to crack. "Dove, I tried. I wrote to you 11 times. The letters came back. Return to sender. I went to the house. Your mother stood in the doorway and told me you had moved away. She would not even tell me what state." "I know," Dove said softly. "She told me years later. She told me a black woman had come to the door looking for me. She told me after she knew she was dying. She said, 'That was your sister,' and I—" She stopped. She closed her eyes. Her hand went to the wooden sign over the doorbell, the one that read, 'All are welcome here.' And she touched it the way a person touches a prayer they've been saying for 30 years. "I hung that sign the day I bought this house," Dove said. 1986. I told my husband, I said, 'Anyone who comes to this door, I am going to let them in,' because there was a door, Lila. There was a door on a porch in Birmingham, and I was on one side of it, and a little girl was on the other side, and the door was never opened. Not once. Not in all the years we knew each other. And I swore that if I ever had a door, no one was ever going to stand outside it and be turned away, not for being slow, not for being different, not for being the wrong color, not for being anything." Lila made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something that has been broken inside them for 32 years finally, sets itself back into place. "I have 32 years of letters I wrote to you," Dove whispered. "I have them all. Come inside. Come inside. I have so much to show you." They stepped forward. They collided on the porch in an embrace so tight and so desperate that both of them staggered sideways into the railing. And for one wild, suspended second, they were 9 years old again, and the world had not yet taught them what cruelty was. 6 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in June, Leslie walked into a small black church on the west side of Birmingham, Mount Zion Missionary Baptist, the same church her mother had attended as a girl, the same church where, in another life, her grandmother had been baptized in a tin tub behind the altar. The pews were full, not because it was a special service, because every black family for 3 blocks around had heard, in the way black families hear things, through telephone trees and front porch conversations and whispered prayers, that Dr. Lila Calloway, the famous Spelman professor, was coming home, and that she was bringing someone with her. When Lila walked in, Geneva was waiting for her in the front pew, leaning on a cane now, the cancer still eating her alive, but her eyes clear and bright. When Lila saw her, she stopped in the aisle, and her hand flew to her mouth, and her mother raised one trembling hand and beckoned her forward. Lila helped her mother to her feet. Geneva took one step, then another. Slowly, painfully, with her daughter at her side, she made her way up the 3 wooden steps to the pulpit. The congregation went silent. Even the babies went silent. And Geneva Calloway, who had spent her whole life polishing silver floors and holding her tongue and surviving, gripped the edges of the pulpit with both hands, and she said, in a voice that shook the way Marguerite's pen had shaken, but did not stop, "My name is Geneva Calloway. Some of you know me. Some of you have known me since I was a girl. I have come to tell you a story I should have told you a long time ago." She paused. She looked out over the faces. Her hands were white on the wood. "I worked for a white family on Highland Avenue, the Holloways. I cleaned their house for 22 years. While I cleaned their house, I raised my daughter alone on what they paid me, and I never told a soul who her father was." A murmur moved through the pews. A single low "Lord have mercy" rose from somewhere in the third row. Her father was Mr. Vincent Holloway, that white man, that railroad man. He fathered my daughter when I was 17, and he went back to his wife, and he never said a word about it again. And I never said a word about it. For 32 years, I never said a word. She stopped. She reached for a glass of water someone had quietly set on the pulpit. Her hand was shaking so badly the water sloshed over the rim. "While I worked in that house, my daughter Lila, my little girl, my baby, sat on the front porch. And the Holloway's daughter, a girl named Dove, a girl they kept hidden in the backyard because they said she was slow, because they said she was unmarriageable. That girl sat on the other side of the porch railing, and Lila taught her to read, through the slats, through the fence. For 12 years, my daughter climbed up on that porch and taught that white child to read, and neither one of them knew they were sisters. Neither one of them knew they shared the same blood. The Lord have mercy rose again, louder this time. A woman in the second pew had buried her face in her handkerchief. A man in the back had stood up, as if his body could not contain what he was hearing. "I'm telling you this," Geneva said, and her voice was not shaking anymore, "because I am dying, and I do not want to die with this in my chest. I have carried this lie for 32 years. I have carried it because I was scared, and because I was poor, and because I was a black woman in Birmingham, and because every system in this city was built to make me carry it. But I am not carrying it anymore." She looked down at Lila. She looked at Dove, standing at the bottom of the pulpit in her blue button-down shirt, the only white face in the room, the only body that did not know the words to the songs that had not yet been sung. "This is my other daughter," Geneva said. "Her name is Dove. She was hidden in a backyard for 16 years because her father was ashamed of her. She is a teacher. She teaches children the world has tried to throw away. And she is my daughter. And she is welcome in this house. And she has been welcome in this house since the day she was born." Dove's hand had come up to her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. Around her, the congregation had begun to stand, one pew at a time, then two, then the whole room. And the sound that rose was not applause. It was something older than applause. It was the sound a black church makes when a body that has been cast out is brought back in. A woman in the first pew, old, gray-haired, her Sunday hat crushed against her chest, reached out and took Dove's hand. Dove looked down at the brown hand holding her white one. She looked at the woman's face, and the woman said, in a voice as steady as a heartbeat, "Welcome home, baby. Welcome home." Dove began to cry. Not the way a child cries. The way a person cries when she has been waiting her whole life to come home, and finally has. The pastor, a young man with a quiet voice and a fierce heart, stepped up to the pulpit. He did not give a sermon. He gave a prayer. "Lord," he said, "we come before you this morning with two daughters, two sisters, two children of the same father, separated by a fence, separated by a lie, separated by every ugly thing this world knows how to build. And we ask you, Lord, we ask you to do what the world would not do. We ask you to bring them home. We ask you to bless the mother who carried the secret in her chest and finally set it down. We ask you to bless the white woman who wrote the letter that brought us here. We ask you to forgive the man who was too cowardly to do any of this himself. And we ask you, Lord, for the children in this room who do not yet know what love looks like. Show them. Show them what love looks like. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen, said the whole church in one voice. And then he opened the church doors. And the congregation, the whole congregation, every last one of them, all the way to the back row, began to sing. They sang, "We'll never turn back." They sang, "Lift every voice and sing." They sang, "Amazing Grace." And somewhere in the middle of the third verse, Dove Holloway Webb, who had not been inside a black church in her entire life, began to sing too. Her voice was small. Her voice was wrong on the high notes. Her voice cracked and wavered and came back, but she was singing. She was singing. The words of a song she had never learned, in a church she had never entered, surrounded by people who had decided in the space of a single morning that she was one of them. Lila put her arm around her sister's shoulder. Dove leaned into her. Geneva reached up from her folding chair and took both of their hands. And the three of them, the black sister and the white sister and the dying mother who had carried the lie for 32 years, stood in the middle of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, and let the music wash over them like a baptism. The congregation did not stop singing. They sang the way black churches sing when something holy is happening in the room, not for an audience, not for a show, but for the dead and for the living and for every child who will ever stand at a railing and wonder if anyone on the other side can hear them. Yes, the singing said, "We hear you. We have always heard you. Come home." There is a particular kind of cruelty that segregation-era white families reserved for their most private betrayals, the betrayals they could not even admit to themselves. And there is a particular kind of love that black families reserved for one another in return, a love so patient, so stubborn, so absolutely refusing to die that it could reach through a porch railing and teach a child to read. Geneva Calloway died 8 months later, in February of 1996, with both her daughters at her bedside. Dove read to her in the last hour. She read The Secret Garden, the same book, the same chapter, the same words Lila had read to her through the railing 33 years before. Geneva smiled. She did not speak. She did not have to. Lila and Dove are real in every way that matters. They are real in the way that the women who raised them were real. They are real in the way that the porch was real, and the letter was real, and the lie was real, and the long, slow, painful work of telling the truth was real. What Vincent Holloway tried to bury is what the universe will not let stay buried. What white supremacy tried to sever is what blood insists on remembering. And what segregation tried to make invisible, the love between a black girl and a white girl, taught through a fence, kept alive by books, is what God, in the end, made the most visible of all. The lesson is not complicated. The lesson is the lesson that black families have been teaching for 400 years. It is this: love is stronger than any lie a coward can build. Truth is stronger than any wall a coward can raise. And the children you abandon in the backyard, the children you hide because you are ashamed of them, the children you teach to believe they are unmarriageable and unteachable and unworthy, those are the children who will one day stand in a church and sing, and the song will be so loud and so beautiful and so absolutely unbroken that the man who abandoned them will not even be able to hear it from the grave. If this story moved you, and I think it did, leave me a comment. Tell me about a person in your own family who taught you something through a fence. Tell me about a letter that changed everything. Tell me about a porch. Tell me about a porch. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of black families, the ones that history tried to erase, and the ones that refused to be erased. We tell them on Sundays. We tell them always. And we tell them so that no coward, no matter how rich, no matter how white, no matter how many years go by, ever gets to bury the truth again. I'll see you in the next one.